Most folks don't realize that a single smirk can carry a price tag in the billions. But that's exactly what happened when a man named Victor Langford decided to lose his cool in a hospital hallway. And let me tell you, there is nothing quite as expensive as a mistake caught on a security camera, especially when the man making it thinks he's untouchable, because that 11-second clip of him striking a pregnant woman and laughing about it started a 30-day countdown to the kind of legal and financial destruction that only someone with a very deep pockets and a very long memory can orchestrate. I'm getting ahead of myself, though, which is something I tend to do when the anger starts bubbling up, and I was definitely feeling it that Monday afternoon. Even if I didn't show it to the world, I'm the kind of guy who gets quiet and precise when I'm mad, the sort of angry that doesn't need to shout to be felt. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and I'm a 52-year-old man living out in the River Oaks, neighborhood of Houston where the streets are wide enough for two trucks to pass, and the oak trees have been there longer than the city itself. It's the kind of place where the houses are grand, but they don't shout about their price tags unless you're the kind of person who already knows what they're worth. I've spent the last 26 years as a private investor, but before that I spent 12 years working as a commercial real estate attorney, which basically means I've spent my entire adult life squinting at the fine print and reading contracts with the kind of focus most people save for a last will. And testament, that habit of paying attention to the details has served me well over the years. My wife, Sandra, is 48, and she's a registered nurse, specifically a charge nurse, over in the cardiac care unit at Memorial Hermann, right there on Fannin Street in the heart of the Texas Medical Center. She's been at it for 24 years now, working those grueling 12-hour shifts 4 days a week. And when she walks through the front door, she's got a specific kind of exhaustion on her face. It's the weariness of someone who has spent the last half day holding the line between life and death and is finally allowed to set that heavy burden down. She was 7 months pregnant on the Monday everything changed, and I was sitting in my home office on the second floor looking over a quarterly report when my phone started buzzing at 4:47 in the afternoon. I could tell right away her voice was pulled tight, in that way she gets when she's trying to handle a crisis without letting me hear the stress in her breath. She told me right off the bat that she was okay, and the baby was fine, because she knew that's the first thing I'd worry about. But then she told me a man had hit her in the hallway right outside the nursing station while she was carrying patient charts. He'd come charging out of a private room, moving way too fast, and when she ended up in his path, he didn't just bump into her. He swung his open hand and slapped her right across the face before telling her to watch where she was going, and then he just walked away with a smile on his face. I sat there staring at the wall of my office for a second, asking her if she was sure she wasn't hurt, and she told me she'd already had the supervisor check her and the little one out. I asked if there was a camera on 4 East near the elevators, and when she said yes, I told her to just come home after her shift and not to say a word to anyone or file any paperwork until I made a phone call. She asked me what I was planning to do, and I told her nothing dramatic. I was just going to call Helen. Now you have to understand the history here, because the context is everything about a decade ago. I flagged Ashworth Capital Group as a solid mid-sized firm that was being overlooked despite having some really strong numbers and a founder who seemed like he knew how to run a shop. Victor Langford had taken a small real estate outfit in Galveston and turned it into a $4 billion private equity powerhouse in Houston. The growth was legitimate and the books were clean, so I put some money in through my holding company, JB Capital Partners, using an intermediary so my name stayed off the documents, which is pretty standard for someone like me who prefers to stay in the shadows. The deal was set up so he kept the keys to the kingdom while I got a piece of the profits, but I made sure. My lawyer at the time, a real stickler named Franklin, wrote in some protections before he retired. One of those was a moral turpitude clause, which is basically a way for investors to cut ties. If the guy running the show does something so rotten, it ruins the company's reputation. And the way Franklin wrote it was genius because it didn't matter if the guy got arrested or convicted. It just mattered if a reasonable investor would find the behavior harmful to the firm's standing. Conrad had never actually met me, and he only knew my holding company as a quiet name on a ledger that never gave him any trouble, so he had no clue what I looked like or who my wife was. When he walked out of that hospital room, he just saw a pregnant nurse in blue scrubs who was in his way, and he acted like a man who hadn't been told no. In so long, he forgot that actions actually have consequences. That smile of his was all I could think about when I picked up the phone at 5:03 to call Diana Whitaker. She's been my attorney for 9 years, and she's the kind of person who keeps a desk so clean you could perform surgery on it. She doesn't tell you what you want to hear, she tells you what's possible. And she picked up on the very second ring, ready to get to work. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But in my line of work, it is a dish served through a 23% stake in a $4 billion empire and a security tape that shows the exact moment a powerful man forgot he wasn't God. I got on the horn with Helen and told her she needed to get her hands on the security footage from Memorial Hermann, specifically the hallway on 4 East between 4 and 5 that Monday afternoon, because my wife had been assaulted and I knew the cameras caught every bit of it. She went quiet for a second, asking if Sandra was all right, and I told her she was hanging in there, but I needed that tape before the hospital system hit the delete key on its usual cycle. I also told her to pull my agreement with Ashworth Capital and look real close at the moral turpitude stuff in Section 8C. She asked me if the guy on the tape was who she thought it was, and I told her I wasn't positive yet, since Sandra didn't know him. But I knew he came out of a private suite, and I wanted to know exactly who was staying there. I told her I didn't want to wait until tomorrow morning to find out, because I wanted to know what kind of fight we were in for before the sun came up. Sandra got home a little after 7, looking steady but tired in that way. She gets after a long shift, and I had dinner ready to go, because cooking is the one thing I can actually control. When the world starts spinning sideways, we sat there at the kitchen table, and she walked me through it all again, from the charts in her hands to the sting of his palm, and that damn smile he gave her as he walked away. She looked me in the eye and asked if I was going to do something stupid, and I told her no, I was going to do something methodical, and that seemed to settle her for the night. Helen called me back around 10 and confirmed what I already knew. The room was booked for a patient under the Ashworth Capital name, and the only visitor on the log was Victor Langford himself. I sat there in the quiet of the kitchen after Sandra went to bed, looking at that contract on my laptop and reading Section 8C over and over, focusing on how a criminal conviction didn't even matter as long as the conduct was rotten enough to hurt the company's name. I whispered, a thank you to my old lawyer Franklin for being so paranoid when he wrote that language, and I didn't get much sleep that night, just thinking about those 11 seconds of footage I hadn't even seen yet. Welcome back to this reckoning we call Sweet Family Revenge. So you might want to grab your snacks and settle in, because the folks in this story had every opportunity to act right, and they just chose to be monsters instead. Make sure you stick around, because this is just getting started. Helen called me at 7:15 the next morning, telling me she had the tape and that the hospital's legal team played ball once they realized the stakes were real. She said the footage was clear as day, showing him hitting my wife on purpose and then smirking at her like she was nothing. She said we had him dead to rights on assault and battery, but she knew I wanted to talk about the business side of things first, so I headed over to her office on Southwest 12th Avenue for a 9 o'clock meeting. The morning sun was hitting the downtown skyscrapers just right when I walked in and found her with the contract already tabbed and a fresh pot of coffee waiting. She wanted to hear my take on Section 8C first to make sure we were seeing eye to eye, and I told her that clause gave me the right to force a buyout of my 23% share if the boss did something that would turn a regular investor's stomach and ruin the company's reputation. She agreed, but reminded me that the contract says we have to show our hand and document the conduct before we can trigger the buyout, which was exactly what I had in mind. When you have a man like Victor Langford in a corner, the last thing he expects is for the quiet guy in the back of the room to pull the rug out from under him, using the very words he signed his name to over a decade ago. and I looked down at that tabbed page in the legal binder and told Helen there was one more angle we needed to play, which was that 11-second clip of the assault, because if that footage happened to catch the eye of a business reporter who covers the Houston private equity scene right after we filed our notice but before the actual meeting, then Conrad's lawyers would be stuck fighting a war on two fronts. At the same time, they'd be trying to manage a buyout trigger and a public relations nightmare, all at once. Helen got real quiet for a minute and told me she wasn't going to officially tell me to go down that road, but she did point out that the footage was a matter of record and it showed events that actually happened in a public place. So the facts were just facts. She basically told me that if a journalist got a hold of it from someone who didn't work in her office, then she wouldn't know a thing about it, and I just nodded because I knew exactly what she was saying without her having to spell it out, so I told her to get that trigger notice filed. That very afternoon, she picked up her pen and said she'd have the draft ready by lunch. And I want to explain what 23% of Ashworth Capital actually looked like, because the number is what makes this real. Over 11 years, that company had grown from $400 million in assets to over $4 billion, and my initial investment of $47 million had ballooned along with it according to the math. Helen's team did based on the earnings over the last 3 years. They owed me exactly $218 million if we successfully triggered that clause, and that wasn't a penalty. It was just the price Conrad agreed to pay when he signed that contract and probably forgot all about it. The notice went out at 2:34 that afternoon on October 8th, and I made sure it went by courier instead of some easy-to-ignore email because I wanted a signed receipt showing it landed right in the hands of the company's legal department, and Conrad's personal lawyer, Helen, called me as soon as the delivery was confirmed, telling me they'd have it within the hour, and she figured we'd hear back from their lead guy within 2 days because they definitely want to talk us down before things got official. I asked her if we were planning on negotiating, and she gave me the best answer possible by saying we weren't there to talk. We were there to enforce the rules. Then I reached out to a guy named Marcus, who's been in the Houston business news scene for 20 years, to get a line to a reporter named Olivia Bennett, who was known for being tough and thorough. I called Marcus that evening and told him I had a story about a hospital assault involving a big shot private equity founder that his institutional investors might be interested in, and he asked if there was a conflict for him. But once I said Victor Langford, he said he'd pass my number along to Karen. She called me at 8:22 the next morning and went straight to the point, asking if the tape was real, if it was legal, and if I had a personal interest in the company, and I told her yes to all of it, because I wanted it out in the open that a major investor was calling out a man for hitting his pregnant wife. The story hit the wire at 6:47 on the morning of October 10th, just as the big money guys in New York were sitting down with their coffee, and the headline laid it all out, saying Ashworth Capital was facing a forced buyout over a hospital incident. And I sat there in my kitchen reading it while Sandra looked at her phone with a look I couldn't quite place. She told me my name wasn't anywhere in the article, and I just looked back at her while the coffee brewed. Most people think a big legal battle is won with shouting and drama in a packed courtroom. But the truth is, it usually happens in a quiet room with a piece of paper that someone forgot they even signed. Because while the world was starting to buzz about that hospital video, Victor Langford still didn't have the slightest clue that the man behind the curtain was the husband of the woman he'd just slapped across the face. He only knew my holding company, JB Capital Partners, which kept me invisible for the time being, and when Sandra asked me if I really thought we could pull this off, I told her Helen was confident the contract was ironclad. Even if the next 30 days were going to be a total mess, she just gave me a kiss and told me to be careful before heading out to her shift. And I just sat there in the quiet of the house thinking about how 11 seconds of footage was about to turn a $4 billion empire upside down. And hey, if you're finding this account interesting, do me a huge favor and hit that like and subscribe button, because honestly, it's the only way I can keep bringing these stories to you, and I truly appreciate the support. It wasn't long before the phone started ringing, and by 11:15 that morning, Conrad's lead guy, Graham Holloway, was on the line with Helen, and he sounded exactly like you'd expect a man who gets paid to clean up rich people's messes to sound, which is to say he was calm and completely unfazed. He tried to pull the old procedural trick of saying we needed a criminal conviction before we could trigger the buyout. But Helen just pointed him right back to the fine print in Section 8C, where it says in plain English that a conviction doesn't matter one bit. Pratt tried to argue that the whole thing was an accident and that we were just spinning the video to look bad, but he knew as well as we did that the tape didn't lie, and when he realized he couldn't bully us into dropping it, he filed a formal objection to try and stall the clock beyond our 30-day window. But that's exactly why I pay Helen the big bucks, because she had already filed for an emergency injunction to keep the buyout process moving while we fought it out in arbitration. She told me we weren't going to lose because the damage to the company's reputation was already measurable, given that their stock positions had tanked 14% the second that story hit the news. And so we ended up in a conference room on Post Oak Boulevard on October 21st for the big hearing. Helen didn't come to play either, as she brought a forensic analyst with a 40-page report and a law expert to explain how these moral turpitude clauses actually work, while Conrad didn't even bother to show up himself. He just sent Pratt and a couple of juniors to do his dirty work. The arbitrator was a retired judge named Leonard who looked like he'd seen every lie in the book, and he sat there without saying a word while Pratt spent a half hour trying to claim the trigger notice was premature. But when Helen got her turn, she just played those 11 seconds of video on a big screen for everyone to see and let the silence in the room do the talking. She laid out the facts showing how the public standing of the company had been crushed. And when Leonard asked Pratt for his response to the footage, the lawyer could only say it was being shown in a damaging light, but Leonard wasn't having any of it. He just looked at him and said, "The man in the video is smiling as he walks away from a pregnant woman he just hit. And that's not a characterization. It's just what happened, and right then and there, he granted the injunction, meaning our 30-day clock was still ticking and Conrad was officially on the hook for every cent of that buyout. You want to know the real secret to winning a war like this? It isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's about being the one who holds the paper that everyone else forgot existed." While the local news was busy replaying that hospital footage and the whole city was buzzing, Victor Langford was still completely in the dark about who I actually was. He only knew me as a corporate name on a ledger, JB Capital Partners, which kept me invisible while the trap was being set. When my wife Sandra asked if I really believed we could take down a giant like that, I told her that my lawyer Helen was sure our contract was ironclad, even if the next month was going to be a complete circus. Sandra just kissed me, told me to watch my back, and headed off to her shift, leaving me in a quiet house to think about how 11 seconds of video was about to dismantle a $4 billion empire. The game started almost immediately. By mid-morning, Conrad's top guy, Graham Holloway, was on the phone with Helen. Now, Pratt is the kind of guy who gets paid a fortune to sweep the messes of the rich under the rug, so he sounded perfectly calm and totally unfazed. He tried every legal trick in the book, starting with the claim that we couldn't force a buyout without a criminal conviction. But Helen was ready for that. She just pointed him right back to Section 8C of the agreement, which stated in plain English that a conviction didn't matter one bit. When he couldn't bully us into walking away, he tried to stall, filing objections just to burn through our 30-day window. That's why you hire the best. Before Pratt could even hang up the phone, Helen had already filed for an emergency injunction to keep the clock running while we moved into arbitration. She wasn't worried about losing because the damage was already done. The company's stock had already plummeted 14% the moment the story broke. We finally met face to face in a conference room on Post Oak Boulevard. Helen showed up with a forensic team and a 40-page report, ready for a fight, while Conrad didn't even show his face. He just sent his lawyers to handle the unpleasantness. The arbitrator was a retired judge named Leonard, a man who looked like he'd heard every lie a human being could invent. Pratt spent half an hour arguing that we were being premature, but when it was Helen's turn, she didn't say much. She just dimmed the lights and played those 11 seconds of video on a massive screen. The room went dead silent. When Leonard asked for a response, Pratt could only stammer that the footage was being shown in a damaging light. Leonard didn't even blink. He just looked Pratt in the eye and said, "The man is smiling as he walks away from a pregnant woman he just struck. That isn't a characterization, it's a fact." He granted the injunction right then and there. The clock was still ticking, and Victor Langford was officially on the hook for every single cent he owed me. You see, Conrad thought he was untouchable because he had the money and the name, but he forgot the most important rule of the game. It doesn't matter how fast you run if you're headed straight into a wall you built yourself. I guess he finally learned that some smiles are a lot more expensive than others. We tend to judge who's in charge by the things we can see: the massive corner office, the expensive suit, or the way a guy walks into a room like he owns the place. Those signals usually mean something, but they aren't the whole story. Real power is often designed to be invisible. It's tucked away in holding companies held by people who don't feel the need to announce themselves, and buried in the fine print of contracts that haven't been opened in a decade. Victor Langford had spent years assuming the quiet parts of his world were safe. He figured silent investors were passive, that legal clauses were just theory, and that nobody in his path could ever touch his future. He was dead wrong, mostly because he'd gone so long without anyone ever checking him. That's the real danger of having too much power for too long. You stop questioning your own assumptions. You start moving at full speed, smiling while you hurt people, not necessarily because you're a monster, though that smile is hard to forgive, but because you've forgotten that consequences even exist. But consequences are always real. I'm not a mean-spirited man, and I didn't get some cheap thrill out of the legal warfare we went through over those 30 days. Throughout the hearings and the buyout, I didn't feel a sense of joy. It was more like the quiet satisfaction of finishing a job that had to be done right. Nowadays, Sandra comes home every Tuesday and tells me about the fresh flowers waiting for her at the station. She talks about the peonies and the roses and says she wished she knew who to thank. I just listen, keep making dinner, and think about that man in the tailored jacket walking away down that hospital hall. He knows the truth now. He knows that the nurse in the blue scrubs had a name he should have respected. He knows that the holding company he ignored was run by a man he never bothered to meet. He's fully aware that 11 seconds of tape and a few sentences on page 44 of an old agreement cost him $218 million and the feeling of being untouchable. But he doesn't know about the flowers. He has no clue that a chunk of the money he wired over on November 5th is sitting in an account on Westheimer Road, set to pay for those arrangements every single week for the next 40 years. He's paying for them, he'll always pay for them, and Sandra will always get to enjoy them. That was the ending I went with. No public crusades or messy prosecutions, just a world where the man who struck my wife pays for her flowers for the rest of his life without ever being able to stop it, all because of a contract he signed 11 years ago. The lesson here is simple. Build your foundation before the storm hits, read every word of what you sign, and never, ever assume you know who the nobodies are in a room. More often than not, the most important person there is the one you haven't even noticed yet.